In 2017, the former head of software under Steve Jobs, Avi Tevanium, basically used the analogy that if you and a friend are being chased by a bear, you don't need to outrun the bear, you just need to outrun your friend. He meant to say that in the world of Tim Cook, Samsung, the Google Android operating system, wasn't doing anything in particular in 2018. So while he could acknowledge that Tim Cook's Apple had sort of stagnated a little bit, it didn't matter in 2017. Well, 8 years later, I think it really does matter. And that's why you have NVIDIA being worth $1 trillion more, Microsoft being worth $800 billion more. Companies that really didn't even exist at the time, Anthropic, Perplexity, OpenAI, are really defining a new era of computing. And it's, you know, somewhere between embarrassing and tragic that Apple, sort of the most iconic company, really isn't even in that conversation. And something like the design position, you know, chief design officer, has been vacant since Johnny Ive left in 2019. I don't think there's any excuse for that.
What's slowing Apple down?
Well, what made Apple so iconic in the early 2000s was really product design, and then Tim Cook's ability to operate those products at enormous scale. They're still playing the scale game. I mean, they build and sell 230 million iPhones a year, and probably be up double that number of products if you were to include everything from AirTags and AirPods to iPads and MacBooks. So their operation game is you know, second to none. They run the world's most sophisticated supply chain, but they're no longer redesigning products in super interesting ways. The Mac Mini is about as boring as you can get in terms of a product, in terms of how it looks. It's almost harking back to the 1990s when computers were all beige. The iPhone really hasn't been redesigned in any meaningful, tangible way since 2019, and I don't think the other products have been either. So they've sort of lost their cool in a certain sense, right? Apple no longer sort of defines how a computer or a smartphone is going to look and feel. And I think, unfortunately, sort of the most sexy smartphones in the world these days are from a bunch of Chinese companies who largely can't sell in America, like the Huawei Mate XT, which in Apple terms is an iPhone and an iPad in one. So really the story of my book is that Apple trained up its own competitors. They didn't just give birth to a smartphone industry in terms of the supply chain. The supply chain took those skills and they sort of offered what Apple taught them to Huawei, Oppo, Vivo, and Xiaomi. And those are the Chinese companies that collectively have a global market share in smartphones, the most iconic device of the 21st century, of more than 55%. So I really think Apple risks being overtaken by Chinese competition in the next 3 years within China. And the only reason that's not a global story is because you can't go to an AT&T store here, let alone down to the local mall and buy a Huawei phone. So there's all sorts of protections, you know, basically the same sort of thing that Donald Trump complains about overseas, right? Non-tariff protections we have in the telecom industry ourselves. But in places like Russia and Indonesia, I mean, the Chinese smartphone manufacturers have an 80% market share, if not higher, and I suspect that's going to be a real problem for Apple in the next 5 to 10 years.
One route Apple is pursuing to avoid the trade conflicts between the U.S. and China is to manufacture in India, which has its own tariff problems with President Trump. But even putting that to one side, McGee says India may not be the success story it appears.
There's more hype than reality in terms of manufacturing in India. Really, they haven't moved the depth and breadth of the supply chain. What they've moved is assembly. And because people largely don't know just how gargantuan Apple's operations in China are, their investments in India can look like a big deal. So just a few months ago, for instance, Apple's Taiwanese partner was investing into India, and they were making dormitories to house 30,000 workers. Well, to any American listener or reader, that sounds like a huge investment until you remember that Tim Cook's own estimate of how many Chinese people are in the supply chain is 3 million, right? So what's 30,000 out of 3 million? That's 1%. The investments in India need to be on a staggeringly different scale for the country to really replicate the depth and breadth of the supply chain. I would say on a superficial basis, India absolutely has what it takes. 1.5 billion people, obviously a massive land mass, and wages comparable to what you had in China 20, 25 years ago. Unfortunately, the differences between China and India are more profound the more seriously you look at this issue. So, you know, the missing topography of Apple that my book really contributes to is an understanding that Apple didn't move to China because China offered competence. Apple moved there because Apple was able to build the competence, right, by training millions of people, by investing billions of dollars, by installing machinery on production lines that otherwise wouldn't be able to afford to do it. Now, Apple can do the same playbook in India. However, who's going to build the 8-lane highways from the factories to the ports? Who's going to build the high-speed rail? That's not something Apple can do. So I think there's great potential for India to be an enormous and successful partner to Apple, but it's going to take a lot from New Delhi or the governors of Tamil Nadu or Karnataka in order for that to make sense. Apple can't just write a blank check. They need government support, and negotiations for this probably have to happen at the level of New Delhi, Beijing, Washington, etc., because you can't really expect a company to make these moves and just risk the backlash from Chinese consumers, where Apple has a $70 billion business, and from Beijing. So you're going to have everybody at a table striking some grand bargain for China, in a sense, to allow the manufacturing to leave its country, because Beijing knows better than anybody else what it means to have Apple as a partner in your country, building up major industrial clusters. And Beijing wants technology transfer to be a one-way gate. The information comes in, it does not leave.
Apple's ties to China have turned out to be both a strength and a weakness. But it's not the only challenge it faces. It's also fallen behind its competitors in the race to artificial intelligence. Mandeep Singh is the global head of technology research at Bloomberg Intelligence.
They have a history of creating new products. Obviously, iPhone is the big cash cow, and they have monetized it extremely well in terms of the newer versions. But AI is something that wasn't in their DNA in terms of, investing upfront. The hyperscalers like Microsoft, Google, Meta, these companies were quite aggressive in terms of believing that AI was a secular theme that will change the products. Apple, on the other hand, has always thought about, hardware design. That has been their strength. And till date, I don't think there is a competitor when it comes to the quality of the hardware that Apple has versus, anyone else. But what they really missed out on is the profound impact AI may have in terms of the functionality, whether you are browsing on your phone or how you interact with an assistant, the App Store. So now they are really realizing, okay, what is it that we could do given everyone else has a 2 to 3 year head start? And they haven't invested in infrastructure or data centers. But now partnerships, M&A seems to be the most viable option because they still control the distribution.
How big a problem when it comes to AI does Apple have? And does Apple know it has a problem?
I think the acknowledgement is coming more now than it was 6 months back. And part of the reason is how big AI has become. So Google right now is processing 980 trillion tokens a month. Now that's 100x in the past 1 year. So that just goes to show what is the level of consumption in AI now versus where it was 12 months back. OpenAI is close to 1 billion monthly active users a day. And so with those kind of numbers, you have to acknowledge that AI is getting more pervasive in our lives and on our devices. Now the question is it enough for Apple to just keep offering AI through their App Store, or do they need natively on the device? And the answer is what OpenAI has showed us with GPT-5 is you can use LLMs for scheduling your diary. You can use LLMs for summarizing your emails and acting as an assistant, which is what Siri was supposed to do. Apple talked about revamping Siri, but we know it has gotten delayed. And so those are the type of things Apple has to do something about it. Otherwise, it can turn people off. And once they move out of the Apple ecosystem, it's very hard to bring people back.
Can they catch up?
I think as long as you control the distribution, which is why, companies like Google, which has made a lot of advancements in their LLMs, they control the browser. They control the Android ecosystem. For me, Apple is similar. They have their Safari browser. They have the iOS operating system. They control the devices. So they have a lock-in with their users. The only trouble they've had is developing this LLM functionality. And so to my mind, an OpenAI or Anthropic also have to catch up. If they want to compete with Apple and take share, they have to come up with devices, you know? And so it's not easy what Apple has done over the past 20 years in terms of the ecosystem they've created. And that's why unless there is a disruption to smartphone or, you know, tablets, and there is a new form factor altogether, which, as I mentioned, Apple has come up with Vision Pro. So it's not as if iVeer is going to challenge Apple. I just don't see any hardware disruption on the horizon to make me feel Apple is at risk, that $3 trillion market cap is at risk. But if I see a new form factor where people just do their work completely differently, it's a substitute for a phone, that's when I'll get worried about Apple.
I think Tim Cook has done a tremendous job in terms of following in the footsteps of Steve Jobs. That's something basically nobody thought was really possible. And Apple's market cap, I believe, has gone from around $300 billion in 2011 when Steve Jobs died to $3 trillion. That's a massive accomplishment on the part of Tim Cook. But I think if you look at what's happening at Apple since 2022, it's not a whole lot, and there's not a whole lot to cheer for. That was the year that they first hit $3 trillion. The share price has barely moved since then. I would look at 2022 Apple and say, mission accomplished. Tim Cook was brought in to scale and distribute at scale the products that Steve Jobs had already created. At this point, the pendulum has swung back to an area where you need a product design leader, a product visionary, someone who's adept in AI, and whatever the qualities of Tim Cook are, it's none of those three things.